Welcome to the Insomnia Project. Sit back, relax, and listen as we have a mundane conversation about the ordinary to help you find your way to relaxation and hopefully some sleep too. I'm your host, Marco Timpano, and I am in Sebastian, Florida. And for our regular listeners, you know what that means. I have the great occasion to be here with my father-in-law, Dan Barker. Dan Barker, welcome to the podcast yet again.
Yes, well, thank you.
Always fun to have you. Our listeners always enjoy it.
It's always fun to be had.
And we were watching a movie on television the other day, and that's what gave me the idea of this particular episode, to talk about ships and traveling on cruise ships and whatnot, because we were having a conversation at lunch about that as well. And I know that you have a love for naval things, in particular ships. And I thought that would be a great place to start.
Well, in my family, if you go back generations, I come from a family of shipbuilders. They all worked just south of Boston in the Quincy shipyard. And my father was actually the manager, the foreman, if you will, of the main shop that made all of the sundry things that go on a ship, portholes and whatever. It was a very, very large machine shop. And my brother worked there in quality control.
What was the name of the company?
Well, when I was a very young kid, it started off, from my knowledge, Bethlehem Steel.
I see.
That would be the name during World War II. It was sold to General Dynamics at one point. And it ended its day as a shipyard building these giant liquefied natural gas ships.
Oh, wow.
In fact, they were so large, I can remember going underneath the stern of these ships as they're being built that stuck out in the river, out in the water.
Oh, my goodness.
You know, the docks couldn't hold them. They were so large.
Behemoths.
Yeah, largest I've ever seen them. When you see them out of the water, it's really an eye-opener.
A sight to behold. What is the largest cruise ship you've been on?
I've been on some fairly large ones from all the cruise companies. The last one was a brand new ship from Holland, America. You're going to have to excuse me for not knowing or remembering all the names of these ships.
Oh, it's fine.
But we've been on Royal Caribbean, Carnival, Princess,
NCL, Norwegian.
Yep.
And what makes a good cruise ship for you?
Well, my wife always got a kick out of the fact that wherever we would go, anytime we would be docking or pulling away from the dock, I had to be up on the top to watch what was going on. One funny incident was in Antwerp, which is a city that's on the river, and they had this...
In Belgium, right?
Yeah. They had this ship, and it had to turn around in the river. And the length of it literally took up the entire river.
Oh, wow.
With how they did it, I don't know. I always thought it was because I was up there helping the captain.
Right. Well, help it visually just steer the ship with where it was going.
Yeah, I was waiting for him to ground it, actually. So what we saw on that particular cruise were a lot of smaller European ports. So.
And what would be one of your favorite ports that you visited on that particular excursion?
Well, one of the ports, what happened on that particular is that one of the tenders, they couldn't get it back up properly, and it dangled
Oh.
from its davits after going to the port. Don't know if it's but Cannes, France.
Okay.
And what was interesting is the film festival was going on.
Oh my goodness.
And so all these ships and large yachts were docked or were out in the, I'm going to call it the harbor, but out in the ocean.
Sure.
With everybody being tended. And so there was a lot of activity. And that was interesting. There were yachts from Turkey, the Turkish president at the time.
Right.
And what was interesting is that the crew members would go around pointing all of this stuff out. They knew, which boat who belonged to whom. So that was one of the more interesting ones. The problem is they could not get that. I think it was a problem with the davit and the stanchions, and they couldn't get it fixed. So we missed the port of Barcelona, which is one I would have enjoyed, I'm sure.
So you just bypassed Barcelona?
Yes, because of course they had to keep on a certain schedule.
Right.
And they couldn't afford to lose an entire day.
Sure.
So, but you were asking, Le Havre, France, I think is a great port.
Right.
Copenhagen was excellent. Antwerp was interesting.
Right.
Because it wasn't really a port, it's a big river.
Right. And you've been on river cruises as well. Like these are big open ocean cruises we're talking about, but you also have been on a river cruise.
Yes. In the United States, we took a river cruise from on the Mississippi from New Orleans up to Memphis. Mm-hmm. And there were several stops in between. And this was a replica of an old stern wheeler.
Sure.
Luckily, it had some modern comforts. Mm-hmm. But it was a very interesting cruise because it was very laid back, relaxing. And the towns we visited, such as, I'll pick one, Natchez. Natchez is a very famous port. And back in the day, and I'm talking 150 years ago.
Sure.
A lot of the
Natchez?
Natchez.
Okay.
Was a port that they used to ship a lot of cotton out of the South.
Okay.
And between Natchez and some small towns, going all the way up to Nashville.
Oh, wow.
There was what they call the Natchez Trace, which is a roadway that they used back in the day to get the goods to, the ports. And, of course, Nashville was also a port, even though the river was much smaller than Mississippi. But anyways, what was interesting, it was like a time, all these beautiful little mansions that had not been really touched, or some of them had been redone, bed and breakfast, etc. But a very small town. I don't think there were 15,000 people that actually lived there today.
Oh, wow. This is Port Natchez.
Natchez,
in
yeah.
Texas. Is that Texas?
I believe it's Mississippi.
Okay.
I was trying to remember that. Yeah.
Sure.
Excuse me.
No worries. There's a couple of. I just tried to look it up. There's a couple of Natchez in the U.S. and I might not have the spelling right. What's the biggest difference between a river cruise and a cruise on the open waters of the seas?
Well, other river cruises we did a double river cruise that went right across France.
Oh, wow.
And again, I have a background family-wise. I have a love of boats and ships. And like all ships, the first day they go over the safety. So they had us all up on the top of this European riverboat and going through everything. And I'm looking around and I'm going, oh, this is interesting. So finally it ended and I said, excuse me, I noticed there's no lifeboats on this. And they looked at me and laughed and said, no, that's right. If we sink, all you do is get out and walk to the shore.
That's pretty great.
Yeah, and that was another. What's nice about river cruising is that you don't have as many people. So at any rate, we booked this around the UK cruise, hitting a lot of the major cities. But we also booked a week before a bus tour of Ireland, something we wanted to do. We wanted to get to see the countryside.
Sure.
And there were some interesting facts. There we are on a bus for over a week with this group of people.
Okay.
Approximately 40 of us, 35 or 40. And so we got to know everyone. The funny thing is, we go on the ship, and the ship is so large, we never saw these people again.
Oh, wow.
We even looked for them at one point, and it was just too big.
Wow.
Just too big.
You sure they weren't avoiding you, hiding out in some...
Yeah, they might have had enough of me. I don't know.
We also were watching a movie last night called Mutiny on the Bounty that starred Marlon Brando. And, it's all about the ship, the Bounty, and what happened on it. But the fascinating part for me was you were giving me a lot of interesting insight on the ship itself. Mm-hmm. And that it was actually made in Lunenburg.
That's
Nova
right,
Scotia,
Nova Scotia.
Which you've been to many times.
Yes. And of course, Lunenburg is known for shipbuilding. I mean, they not only did the Bounty and the replica of the Bounty, they also did the Blue Nose, which is a very famous Canadian ship that won many sea races.
It's a schooner.
With a schooner.
And
that's right.
Anyone who has a Canadian dime, the 10-cent piece, you'll notice on that is the Blue Nose 2, I believe, schooner. And that particular coin, the artistry on it was done by one of our past guest grandparents, Emmanuel Hahn.
Oh, okay.
So anyways, but back to Lunenburg and the schooners that they built.
So at any rate, when they were going to do the movie, they hired at that time the most famous idol of the movies, which happened to be Marlon Brando. And of course they had some other excellent people there, Richard Harris, Trevor Howard. But they decided what they would do is actually find somebody to build a replica of the Bounty. Mm-hmm. And looking around the world, they ended up in Nova Scotia because they could at least read all the blueprints and everything left over and everything they could find on the Bounty. And so they knew, that these folks could actually do it.
Oh, wow. So they built it, the replica from the original blueprints the original Bounty.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And they did the same thing with the Blue Nose, and they've done the same thing, I think, with several other ships. One of the important aspects, for me anyways, is that there's a lot of side stories that go with that building. They ended up building the Bounty, the copy of it, but in order to sail it, and this replica did have engines and other more modern nautical devices
features
to help it. Yeah. But one of the interesting things is they actually had 8 of the craftsmen that built the Bounty sailor.
Oh, so they were actually sailing the ship after they built it?
Yes, because they had to get it over to Tahiti in order to film the movie.
I see.
So what's interesting is that they used these gentlemen in the movie. I don't think any of them, or very few, had speaking parts, but they were always in the background. And if you saw somebody climbing the rigging, trust me, that wasn't a Hollywood actor.
I see. It was one of the gentlemen who made it in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yeah, that film, I think, came out in 1962.
Okay.
I'm going to guess. I tried to look it up after. But the ship then had an interesting trajectory after that because the movie company or the movie house that was built, who was making the film, wanted to set the ship that they built for the movie on fire for the climactic scene that happens in the movie.
Right. And what took place is that apparently Marlon Brando was quite a handful, trying to rewrite many of the pieces, the scripts, etc. And of course, they tolerated him as best they could. But finally, he said, "Look, this last scene where we burn the ship," he says, "if you're going to burn the ship, I'm going to walk right out. I'm not going to finish this movie."
Sure.
And so the studios apparently thought about it and said, "Well, if Marlon doesn't want us to burn the ship, we've got to find another way of doing it."
Right.
So the ship survived. And what does the studio do with the ship after the movie?
It's huge. It requires a lot of crew to keep it.
Yep. And so at first they went around to when the movie was opening, and on the seaports they would get the ship there, like New York, Seattle, L.A.
Right.
And this, they found out, was quite a tourist attraction.
I see.
In fact...
so they would dock it in these ports where the movie was playing. It was released in November 8th, 1962. So as it was released in various cities, the actual bounty that was in the film would show up.
Right. In many, many places as best they could do it. And of course it was in the Pacific, so it had to come back to the West Coast.
Sure.
First, then go down Panama Canal up the East Coast.
I see.
So that took time.
Right.
They weren't able to do that in a day. But they found it was quite a tourist attraction. So they started, basically, they started taking it around, not just supporting the film, but as an independent site. They were at the New York World's Fair with it, and it became, a lot of people saw it. And then as time progressed, it's gone to tall ships, and it's always been one of the most favorite ships out there.
Sure.
But it was sold to other people, because finally the studio said, well, we got our life out of it.
Right.
It takes money to maintain it.
Sure.
And,
the movie's come and gone.
Right.
Right.
So it was sold to a couple of parties. I mean, one happened to be Ted Turner,
right,
just as he was getting his empire started. And, of course, he's quite a yachtsman.
Yeah, because he won the America's Cup, if I'm not mistaken.
At one point, yeah. And, he appreciated it. I think his decision to buy it was, they can't let something like this just fade away.
Sure.
So he had it at one time up in Massachusetts, up in, it's a town called Fairhaven next to the city of Fall River, I believe. They bought it and had it as part of their, what they call Battleship Cove, which has a submarine, the USS Massachusetts from World War II, which is a big battleship, like the Missouri.
So this town, this coastal town in Massachusetts, has other ships in its harbor that are tourist attractions. People come all over to see that.
Yeah. So this was a great addition. Problem is, by this time, we're talking 30 years from when it was built, it needed some heavy-duty maintenance.
Because it's a wood craft, right?
It's a wooden ship built in the time period of the 1790s. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it didn't have fiberglass. It didn't have a steel hull, nothing like that. And, of course, the timbers would just get all that time in the water, soaked, start to rot away, etc.
Sure.
So it had quite a history after the movie, and was very popular amongst and would be today, right up until the time it sank.
Right. And
it sank during Hurricane Sandy that battered New York. So at any rate, I mean, the Bounty, being a replica, is amongst one of many that has been done. And, I mean, I grew up just outside Plymouth, Mass, and of course the Mayflower too,
Okay.
which is still there.
Sure.
And when you get on I'm going to call it a ship, but a boat like that, because it is quite small.
What's the difference between a boat and a ship?
Well, a lot of it is size.
I see. Okay.
I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
But I think a ship was more a commercial vehicle. The Queen's yacht
Right.
is the size of a ship. Takes 200 and some odd people to sail it. But I don't think they call it a ship. I think it is the yacht. It's a boat.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the Mayflower 2, you were saying.
When you visit it and you see what people had to go through to sail it, i.e. the between the decks are only about 5.5 to 6 feet.
Right.
I mean, I can't stand up in it. Most people today wouldn't be able to. But the Bounty, when you look at the movie, pay attention to the under the deck there, and when the scenes are done, because they're all bending over. The sails and the yacht arms and everything else on these boats, these ships, were something. But then you think, well, this Mayflower made it across the Atlantic.
Wow.
I wouldn't do it.
Right.
I would need something about 5 times that size. And of course, that's something special to me because I am a descendant of the
Mayflower
Chilton family, which was on the Mayflower. How they survive, you hear about the diseases and everything, and you say, you can see how that happens.
Certainly a big difference from back then and the cruise ships that you enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, what little cabins there were on the Bounty, as an example, they used the captain's cabin, of course, for the breadfruit plants. And so old Bly had a little cabin that measured like 8 feet by 5 feet or something. Only enough room for his bunk.
Yeah, that's why they were traveling to the tropics, was to get the breadfruit plant back to...
And bring it back to
England.
The British colonies. I believe Jamaica.
To Jamaica was the destination for the breadfruit plant. I have 7 differences between a boat and a ship, or a ship and a boat, and you're right, size is number 1. It's the most important aspect, which is different between a ship and a boat, is the size. It is said that the best way to differentiate between a ship and a boat is to remember a ship can carry a boat, but a boat cannot carry a ship.
Okay.
So there you go. Operational areas, the crew, navigational and technology, cargo capacity, construction and design. When it comes to construction and design, ships are complicated structures having a variety of machinery systems and designing aspects for safety and stability of the ship. A boat is much simpler in construction and built, and lesser machines and design complexity. So yes, it stands to reason that and the 7th thing is propulsion. That makes a difference. But it stands to reason that you would have to go to a old shipbuilding town like Lunenburg if you want to build these complex ship replicas.
When you look at modern shipbuilding today, what they do is they start with a section of the hull, but only a section. There's no keels laid down or anything. So just think of it like sliced bread. Okay. And everything that's going to go in that section is going to be put before the ship is ever put together.
I see.
And that's much different than any of the old-fashioned shipbuilding that used to take place.
Is there a ship that exists today or that exists in the past that you would have liked to have been on, even just to see it? Because you've been on the Blue Nose too.
Yeah,
you've been on the Mayflower replica. Yeah. You've been on some big cruise ships.
Yeah.
You've been on some smaller boats, from pontoons to kayaks to you name it. It's the sound of a crack of thunder happening in the background too.
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer, but I'll say that My grandfather, I have two grandfathers.
Mm-hmm.
One was a merchant marine captain who went down during World War II. And the other was a Grand Banks fisherman.
Oh, wow.
Out of Boston. In his early days. And similar to the Blue Nose, that type of schooner, where they would drop the dories over and you'd take your lines out and drop them in.
Right.
Catch the cod. That would, a schooner would be, a ship that would be interesting.
Right.
Just to go out for the day, not
not to live on.
Oh.
My great aunt was on the second to last voyage of the Andrea Doria before it sank. So she went on it, and then the next time it sailed, or the next time it went out, it sank.
Yes, and I remember that as a kid.
Sure.
Because it didn't sink right off. It was a slow sink.
Right.
And so they actually had planes and helicopters around it.
Saving people.
Yeah, shelling it going down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think most of the people survived because of the slow sink of that ship.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, when you're talking ships, talk about the port of Halifax up in Nova Scotia.
Sure.
The great explosion where, two ships collided in the harbor.
Right.
And basically took out the entire city.
Mm-hmm.
Every building, everything that was floating got impacted.
Right. There's still some remnants of that. If you're walking around Halifax, you can still see some remnants of the explosion.
You can see remnants, and what I find fascinating about that is they, once in a while, they'll find a projectile or something up on the shore.
Right.
And they have to detonate it to get rid of it.
Sure. Sure. Halifax has a huge sort of naval history and interesting connection to ships and whatnot, because when the Titanic sank,
yes,
a lot of the dead ended up going to Halifax, where a lot of the survivors went to Boston, right? Was it Boston? I think so.
Yeah, both Boston and Halifax have a, let's call it a marriage of sorts.
Right.
During the explosion, one of the first trains full of goods was actually from Boston. The people of Boston, bandied together to get some help up to Halifax. One of the things about the port of Halifax, it's in my estimation, I mean, it's wide enough, certainly, but it's quite long. And because of the formation of Halifax right on the side of the hill,
right,
it took out every building. Now, everything over the hill survived. So the blast actually just went right up.
Quite an impact, yeah.
But it's still a fascinating harbor.
Before we go, what are a couple of tips you would give to anybody who hasn't traveled on ships or boats and is going on a cruise or going down a river that they should know?
Oh, well, of course, life aboard the cruise ship is really something. I mean, the meals are ongoing.
Right.
And usually quite sumptuous, I mean, quite large, and et cetera. And you have your choice of everything. I mean, most of the ships we were on had everything from ice cream bars to pizza parlors to whatever. So,
sure.
So bring an appetite, because you're going to gain some weight.
Maybe an antacid, too.
The thing about cruising is when you get to the ports, you should have a signed up for one of the expeditions.
Sure.
To see what that port's about, etc.
Yeah, sure.
Countryside.
A lot of these ships will have fantastic excursions for their passengers to take advantage of.
Exactly. One of the ones I always laugh about now is we were down, I believe it was in Colombia, and we visited a banana plantation.
Right.
And we had to go on this bus, and it went for a couple of hours to get there. And we had a nice enough guide.
Sure.
And he'd say, now understand, and this is what I took away from the whole day, is that all bananas are edible. So to prove that, he stops the bus, goes out to the jungle, cuts some bananas, brings them back, and we all have these bananas. But the second thing is, it takes 21 days when they cut the bananas, and the bananas have to actually ripen in transit, etc. It takes 21 days to grow a banana.
Well, there you go. The things that you find out about when you're cruising. Well, as the thunder rolls in the background, we've approached the end of this episode of the Insomnia Project. Dan, I want to thank you for all your insight on all past episodes, in particular this one about ships.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm no great authority. It's just that, I guess, with my lineage of shipbuilding and my family and ship captains, I just love them.
Yeah,
so.
you listen. Sharing the passion that you have for subject matter like ships is always appreciated.
Well, just one side note.
Sure.
I always said there was one or two fields I want to get into. One was something to do with music,
right,
or something to do with boats and ships. When I got out of the Army, I was blessed by the fact that I was able to do both. I worked for a company called Boston Whaler that made pleasure boats. So I got that out of my system. And certainly playing drums, I had my own passion for that.
Right. So now we got to get you to work as a drummer on a cruise ship.
That's ideal.
Okay.
That's ideal. In fact, on the Mississippi River cruise ship, when we were walking on, they had a Dixieland band playing. I looked up, and they had a drum set that I actually helped invent.
Wow.
So,
did you take the opportunity to jump behind it and teach him a lesson?
No, but I did ask him. I didn't understand where he bought it or anything.
Right.
And so I got all that info. But he told me, he said, I love this drum set. I have, and I could mention some names. I will mention Pearl and Yamaha on the boat. He says, I prefer this one. And the name of the drum set, which was short-lived,
right.
We only had it for 1 year, was Stag, S-T-A-G-G.
All right.
So if you ever see one,
pick it up.
Yeah, it's only one of a couple hundred.
It's worth some money. Well, Dan, thanks once again for being part of our podcast. As you put your glass down, that sound is the glass hitting the table. It's always fun to record here in the kitchen. I'll take a picture because it's now getting really dark for our listeners to see.
It looks like night hitting us here.
Where we're recording. As always, we hope you enjoyed the Insomnia Project. Listen to us on Radio Public if you can. Every listen on Radio Public gets money towards our podcast. We recorded this episode on a stormy afternoon in Sebastian, Florida. Listen and sleep.